it's Rachel with Reflective Redesign, and today I am working on this beautiful Drexel campaign style dresser. This is a solid wood piece. It is gorgeous. It has these inset brass handles that I really want to accent, but it does kind of have this aged orangey yellow speckled look that I am not so crazy about. I found this on Marketplace for $100 and I'm looking forward to refinishing it for my boys' room. They need a little more space for clothes. They share a room, so they need a little bit more dresser space. So I am excited to see, hopefully this will turn out how it is in my mind. We'll see. But let's get started. First things first is a good clean. I removed all the drawers and numbered them with pencil on the back panel to ensure each drawer ended up back in its original spot. I used my shop vac to vacuum up as much as I could before a good wipe down with some Crud Cutter. Any cleaner with a good degreaser works well. Just make sure to wipe down with just plain water after to remove any cleaner residue. I continued working on the drawers following the same process of vacuuming and wiping down. After I cleaned it, we moved it in our house where it's set for the next 6 months until I was able to get back to it. Finally, the time came and I got rolling, removing all the inset brass hardware and brass corner pieces, which are signature to the campaign style furniture. A flathead screwdriver was all I needed to carefully pry up the corner pieces. I wanted to achieve a dipped look with this dresser, which involved staining the top and painting the bottom 2/3. Since I was going to be using furniture stripper, I sanded to roughen up the surface so the paint stripper could penetrate the finish. A leaf blower makes dust removal much quicker and enjoyable. I wiped any leftover dust away with a clean microfiber cloth. Now, time to remove the finish. I poured the paint stripper directly to the surface, and it's okay to be very generous with the paint stripper. I look pretty stingy though in this video. I did make several passes though. Then you come back and use a cheap chip brush to spread it out, but don't brush it too thin. I set my timer to 15 minutes and let the product sit while I went to work on cleaning up the hardware. I placed all the hardware I removed in an old metal pan I found at the thrift store and added a mix of water and vinegar for it to soak in. I cranked up the heat to speed up the cleaning process and let it simmer for about 20 minutes. Once cool, I rinsed off the pieces. I used liquid barkeeper's friend to polish up the hardware even more. I rubbed it into the brass and then used some fine steel wool to shine them up. Now let's get back to removing the finish. I used a metal scraper to carefully scrape the finish off. It's recommended to use plastic versus metal scrapers to avoid gouging the wood. But I'm a rebel, so I went with the metal route, but I was very careful. This can be such a messy process, but it is so satisfying to see the finish come off so easily. With some more stubborn finishes or pieces that have multiple layers of paints or stains, you may have to do another coat of chemical stripper. Thankfully, this finish removed very easily. Next up, I sprayed it down with water to neutralize the paint stripper. You can also use a mix of water with vinegar, mineral spirits, or afterwash that some companies make. I used steel wool to remove any leftover residue. Once the piece had dried, I used my sander and 120 grit sandpaper to even out the surface. So you remember earlier when I mentioned this was a solid piece? Well, this was the point when I realized I was wrong. I added some glue to the peeling veneer and placed something heavy on it while it dried. Meanwhile, I continued sanding the entire piece with 120 grit to remove the shine from the surface, so down the road the primer would have something to grip to. Once the glue for the repair dried, it was time to add some stainable wood filler to the area with the missing veneer. While sanding, I realized I had never removed the keyhole brass from the bottom drawers. I was concerned this would be a difficult process, but a few wiggles with a flathead screwdriver and it popped right out. One of the drawers had some superficial damage, so I added Bondo glazing and spot putty to even things out. Once dried, I sanded it smooth. The next few steps involved power sanding the surface that will be stained using different grits, moving from coarser to finer grits. I ended at 220 and then I hand sanded using 220 grit for the last step, trying to avoid the swirl marks power sanders can make. Once all the dust was wiped away, it was time to get staining. I was a little untraditional with this step, and instead of using a pre-made stain, I used a brown tinted glaze and added red and black craft paints to bring in the colors I was wanting in the stain. What I like about this method is it's buildable. Once the glaze dries, I can add more until I gradually reach the color. Glaze also dries slower, so there's some open time to play with the colors you're adding in. If you don't like it, you can add water and wipe it off. Once I applied the glaze, I used a cut-up t-shirt to wipe away the excess. I wanted to paint the bottom half blue, so I kept checking the stain with the blue color to see if the colors complemented, and then I would adjust with the next round of glaze. Once the color was right and it had dried overnight, I taped it off and covered the stained part. I brushed some water-based polyurethane along the tape line, which is a nice hack to keep paint from bleeding, so you have a nice, crisp paint line. It's finally time for paint. I like to use my sprayer even for priming when I can to create a nice, even surface. I'll link the sprayer I use below. It's around $100 and is a great budget sprayer that has worked really well for me. After the primer dries, I use a very fine sanding sponge, about 400 grit, to smooth any bumps in the finish, then I wipe it all down. Now time for my favorite part, the color. I tried a new paint brand with this dresser called Wise Owl 1 Hour Enamel. It sprayed beautifully and covered so incredibly well in one coat. The beauty of the 1 hour enamel paint is it is dry in 30 minutes and ready to recoat in 1 hour, which really helps speed up the painting process when you aren't waiting so long for it to dry. It also claims that it is 90% cured within the first hour and doesn't need a top coat. I was incredibly pleased with this paint and will definitely use again. Once dry, I couldn't wait to see the brass hardware up against the blue paint. Now for the moment of truth. I decided to dry brush some gold spray paint onto the hardware to balance some of the green tones that were coming through in the brass. I was so excited to get the hardware installed. It looked so beautiful with the blue paint and the dark stain. At this point, I top coated the entire piece. Even though the paint I used had a built-in top coat, since I was top coating the stained part, I figured it doesn't hurt to add a little extra protection to the rest of it. Since I sprayed the dresser with the drawers in, there was some touch-up painting I needed to do to the edges. I was wishing at this point I had taped up the sides of the drawer because some overspray needed to be removed from the drawer sides. Just a little reminder of where we started. This campaign-style Drexel dresser was such a fun project. I loved the sophisticated look it had in the end. The hardware just shines next to the dark stain and the navy paint. Thank you so much for watching. If you like what you see, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel and check out my other videos.